Hunter, are you a fan of Ryan Reynolds? Or do
Am
you know
I a
who
fan?
Ryan Reynolds is?
I know who Ryan Reynolds is. I guess I'm a fan. I've seen some of his movies. Free Guy I thought was very funny. I don't know if you've seen that one.
That's the one where he's like a character and said like not a or maybe it's a video game. I don't know.
Yeah, that's the one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyways, he seems like a very charming individual. I don't know what he's really like in real life because I've never met him, but yeah, sure.
Right. Yeah. No, I think to your point, at least his outward persona. I also don't know Ryan Reynolds. Very seems like a very fun guy. Seems very what's the word? Convivial.
Mhm.
Right. Very charming. And I've definitely seen a lot of his movies. You know, I've seen the Deadpool movies.
Yep.
I have not seen Free Guy, though it does seem like an interesting movie. I think generally he's, just a very popular actor because of the reason that he is, charming, handsome, and very good at probably acting. I'm not
Yeah,
an
he's,
acting
he's a
coach,
funny
but
guy. Yeah.
the funny guy. And then I think on that same note, are you familiar with Rob McElhenney?
I'm less familiar, and I know him from the context of what we're about to talk about. And I've seen It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, I guess, a few times in the past, but I haven't tracked it very closely.
Yeah. So I'm a big Rob McElhenney fan. I think I love the It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia TV show. I've been watching it for now way too many years. We'll talk a little bit, I think, more about both of these actors and sort of where they're coming from. I also know Rob McElhenney is just a very well-known persona within Philadelphia in general, which I think in my head, there are few people, famous people who are actually very specifically tied with a specific place.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Rob McElhenney is actually pretty well tied to the city of Philadelphia, which I always find pretty cool.
Well, I think that when you become a high profile fan of a sports team, like he is with the Eagles, that becomes conflated with the city and people sort of know because of that, I think.
Right. Yeah. He also he actually started a Patty's Pub after sort of named for his famous TV show in Philadelphia as well. So I think people are pretty familiar with him from that angle as well. Well, all that's to say is we are talking about these two actors. Why? Why are we talking about these two actors today?
Because these two actors in 2020, at the end of 2020, purchased a Welsh soccer team.
Exactly. They purchased a Welsh soccer team, which seems a little bit outside of their area of expertise, maybe.
Curious.
And we're talking about them because they've since, using sort of their, cachet, their Hollywood cachet, have been able to, money, yes, and a lot of money, have been able to rocket a otherwise unknown, soccer team into the sort of stratosphere a little bit. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. And so, what does that mean? Well, today is a little bit of a different kind of episode than, maybe what we're accustomed to doing. We've done a lot of episodes that are more commodity based, company based, something like that, right? We did beer, geography is beer. We did geography is coffee. We did geography is Lego. These things obviously have a very strong geography to them, and it's, really fun to explore. Today, however, we're talking about, well, it's kind of a company, but it's still not quite the same, because the company, of course, is Wrexham AFC, which is a soccer team. And really what we're actually kind of talking about is more of the phenomenon behind Wrexham AFC, because it has just some interesting geographies attached to it, things that sort of maybe fly in the face of what is sort of considered to be the norm.
How does this team from a small town in Wales have this global purchase, this global attention in a pretty short period of time? And that's an interesting question.
Yeah. And we don't know where this is going to go, right? This could be a flash in the pan kind of thing. That happens. However, it's a big flash at the moment. It's a pretty big flash. So we're going to talk a lot about that today. A lot of this is going to be contextualized within sort of the geography of soccer at large, sort of helping us talk a little bit more about maybe some of the bigger sports teams. So just to, clarify, in order for me to prepare for this episode, I did watch the entire series of Welcome to Wrexham, which, if you're not familiar, is a docu-series that's on Hulu that sort of talks a lot about sort of the build up to these two actors buying the team, to sort of their first season as owners of this team, sort of where they're taking the team, all that kind of stuff. I thought it was pretty good. I enjoyed it. It was definitely a bit rosy at times, in my opinion, sort of how they were painting it. But what I think was really interesting about the series, which maybe we'll dive into a little bit, is just that the series didn't make a sort of a documentary series about just a soccer team, a sports team. But really about the town and the people who live in the city. So it has a sort of a nice sort of geographic, sort of place-based bent as well, which, as geographers, we really appreciate.
And this is the series that brings the team to the attention of people and companies who would later become sponsors. And
exactly,
this is a huge launching pad for them.
Yeah. And, obviously, they were able to have this series because of who their new owners are, right? There are far wealthier owners of sports teams who probably still wouldn't be able to pull this off in the same way that these two were, given their connections in the industry, given their reputations in the industry, that kind of stuff. So while we're talking about Wrexham AFC today, we're going to be talking a lot about the town of Wrexham. Because you really can't separate the two at this point, and we'll talk a little bit about why. But the reality is that Wrexham is a pretty small town, so there's not a whole lot more to it. Obviously, there is more to Wrexham, but they're pretty synonymous with each other, given this global phenomenon. And of course, I also did a bunch of other research, so it's not just based on the backs of the series,
right?
But before we do that, of course, we always want to do a little bit of terminology check. And we've done this particular terminology before, but Hunter, let's talk a little about soccer versus football.
Right. So soccer is the common word that's used for this sport in the United States, which is where we're recording from. So we're going to use soccer. It's used in some other places as well. It used to actually be used pretty extensively in Great Britain. That fell by the wayside, I think, in the 70s or something like that, in part because people in the United States were using the term. Mm-hmm. But this is the sport that most people know as football, although in the United States, football tends to mean American football, which would seem redundant to call that American football here, I suppose. But anyways, we understand that it's football in most places, but we're just going to call it soccer.
Right. I mean, we're here in the United States, and we recognize that. We also recognize that it's called football other places. We also recognize that most of our listeners are from the United States. So just given the obvious conflating between the two words, we're just going to go ahead and call it soccer. But we definitely don't mean any disrespect to anybody who's listening to this who really definitely prefers it to be called football. We're going to call it soccer for that very specific reason.
I think we do a little bit more. If you want to find out more about this debate between these terms, you can go back to our World Cup episodes, which were some of the early episodes for us. And it's a two-parter. And so that's good context. Maybe you finish listening to this, and then go back and listen to those if you get a chance.
Yeah, no, those are great episodes to listen to, because it sort of also geographically situates sort of the world's largest tournament, and talking about the sport sort of at large. We're talking sort of, I mean, it's a global phenomenon, but we're talking pretty hyper local situation today. That's when right. obviously is much more worldly. And then there's this other thing that we should probably just briefly touch on, which is the English soccer pyramid. And so, Hunter, can you walk us through a little bit about what promotion and relegation is?
Yeah, sure. So in many places in the world, in soccer leagues in particular, and this is the way that it works in England, the teams that finish at the bottom of the table, at the bottom of the league at the end of the season, they get relegated to the league below. And then the teams that finished first get promoted. Sometimes there's a playoff system involved. Usually, I think in the championship, the top two teams go, and then teams 3 through 6 play a playoff. But in any case, and of course, once you get to the Premier League, you can't promote any further. But the idea is that it's a dynamic situation, and that technically speaking, a team that's formed at one of the lower leagues could continually get promoted all the way up to, and in the case of England, the Premier League. And again, this is not the way things work in the United States, but in the world of soccer, this is pretty common throughout the world.
Right. Yeah. If you're a fan of sports in the United States, you're a fan of the NFL, the MLB, NBA, what have you, it doesn't really matter. we don't have that system. Instead, we would have something called a franchise system. And if you're more interested in learning a lot more about the franchise system, we also have a really fun episode on sort of the geography of sports teams moving, which is really, really fun to explore, where we talk a lot more about sort of the US context of sort of how sports are run and sort of, well, why they're able to move in a way that they are not really able to move elsewhere in the world. But just to, frame that, if you're a team in the NFL and you come in the bottom of your league, you're just going to be back in the NFL next year. So it's a very different system. And a large part of why we're talking about promotion and relegation right now is because it directly feeds into maybe why Ryan and Rob wanted to buy a team that is very much not in the English Premier League. But before we do that, Hunter, why would anybody even want to buy a soccer team in the first place?
I think it's a good question. I think that on the surface, it would seem to be about money, that it's an opportunity to make money. And maybe that does pan out in certain cases. However, I think that there's probably safer investments. So if you had a lot of money, it probably wouldn't be the first thing you thought to do to make a lot of money is buy a soccer team. So I think it has to do with prestige. It has to do with people who are passionate about sport, but also want to be attached to a winner. And to have some kind of increasingly global profile, because a lot of European teams, English teams, for example, have a global profile. Mm-hmm. So I think it speaks to something, there's economics and money on the one hand, but I think it speaks to something more, and this idea of being associated and tied to a winning team and having brought a team from maybe reasonable amounts of success to the top. And we've seen that with Manchester City, for example, where a team that had, kind of lived in the shadows in terms of championships and trophies to Manchester United, they've won the last 3 leagues in England and have performed really well. And that's because of the people who bought the team. And so that's what I think is at stake with buying a soccer team.
Yeah. And I think just to add on to that a little bit, there's this concept that, is, quote unquote, sports washing. These organizations or people sort of buy a team in order to maybe attach themselves to a name that is much more likable in some ways, or maybe less controversial. And so we see a lot of that happening as certain people buy certain teams for various reasons. There are some people who do buy teams in order to try and make money. I think Manchester United's Glazer family is probably one of those.
They famously plunged a team that wasn't in debt into debt.
Yeah.
So that they could make money. So that's more of a money-making thing. Of course, the fans have, from the very beginning, have been pretty antagonistic towards this ownership arrangement. And there's a lot of talk this year about the Glazers maybe selling the team. That remains.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. You heard it here first. I'm just joking.
It's not here first. Some people may have heard it here first, but if you're following the situation, this is not where you've probably found out about it.
Right. So anyways, yeah. So Rob and Ryan have bought this team. We're going to talk a little bit more about that process later, but let's talk about a little bit about what is Wrexham AFC. So first, if you haven't caught on yet, Wrexham AFC is a professional soccer team that most recently played in the 5th tier of English soccer. Now, we've already said where Wrexham is kind of based, which is Wales and not England. And yet they are here playing in the 5th tier of English soccer, now the 4th tier in the English League 2. Why is there a Welsh team playing in the English sort of system in the first place?
Well, apparently when the English League was established in 1921. So this is sort of the precursor to the Premier League, but that tracks with, it's basically the same organization, the same structure. There wasn't a national Welsh league at the time. So there was a Welsh league from 1890 to 1902, apparently, and then there were some district leagues. But teams, and there's a small handful of teams from Wales, including Wrexham, and perhaps much more famously Cardiff and Swansea, which compete in the English system. So there is now, starting in 1992, there's a Welsh league, and apparently these teams had the option of joining that. But with the much higher profile of English soccer and more chances to compete in Europe and that kind of thing. I guess that's the reason, is because these teams have been formed early enough and were established at the time the English league structure was established, and they got ushered into that situation.
Right. And, to further contextualize this, perhaps more well known is the Scottish Premier League, if you're a fan of soccer. And within that league is two really large teams, with respects to their league, which is Celtic out of Glasgow and Celtic. Rangers also out of Glasgow. What?
Celtic.
Sorry.
Celtics play in Boston.
Celtic play in Glasgow. But regardless, those two teams are very well known for being sort of the dominant teams within the Scottish Premier League. I also know that there's been, talks, over the years. I don't know how serious about them joining the English Premier League for the same reason, that there's just more prominence as being part of that league and more chances to play maybe higher competition, which would then make you a better team in theory, or maybe there's more wealth involved there as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a really good reason for why is there a team Wrexham playing in the English system? Well, it's for all that reasons. However, they're not in the Premier League yet. Maybe someday we'll talk about that.
Yeah, right.
Today, they're definitely quite a few rungs down the English soccer pyramid. This would be most synonymous here in the US with what we would call a minor league, although I would hesitate to use that word anywhere in England. But
it's the closest thing we have to
It's the closest thing we have. So, if you're a really big baseball fan here, right, just like one of the diehard fans, you're obviously you're familiar with the MLB. And the MLB would be pretty similar to the English Premier League, right? They're both the top tier system. If you're a big baseball fan here, there is a minor league system, and this would be where they most recently were, which was the 5th tier, would be closest to the single A level. So there's a lot of different pyramid structures in MLB, just like that. But again, there's no promotion relegation. So if you're a single A baseball team, the only way you can move up is if you meet some sort of, I'm guessing, economic criteria. I haven't done a lot of research into it.
Yeah, and it's not the same. It's not exactly the same, but for people who are casual listeners in the United States, it's maybe helpful to think of it as somewhat analogous to a single A baseball team.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's sort of where they're at today. That's sort of what Wrexham AFC is. But let's talk a little bit about why are we even talking about Wrexham AFC today, rather than maybe the more obvious example of a team that maybe we should be talking about would be a team such as Real Madrid or Barcelona or Manchester City or any of the other sort of mammoth, mega huge teams. And so to me, it's really about well, we could talk about any of these teams. We could talk about all of those teams.
And we might.
Right. Yeah, they would make really solid episodes. Today, we're talking about Wrexham AFC really because it's more about the speed at which Wrexham has become more of a global brand. And, I'm using that word a little bit more liberally here. Obviously, it's not at the same level as a lot of these other teams, but it's sort of having this moment, this flash in the pan moment that's spearheaded by two very famous people and how they've sort of been able to leverage themselves and their own geographies to raise what is essentially a hyper local team to something that is almost competing in terms of popularity with some of some really popular teams, right? Even if they're not quite as high as Manchester City or even Nottingham Forest, some of the smaller teams in the English Premier League, they're punching way above their weight.
Yeah, they're not on the par of some of these huge teams, but for a lower division team to have the amount of global attention that they've received is interesting and notable. And that's why we want to talk about it. We want to explore it a little bit.
Exactly. And if you are a soccer fan, you're probably aware of Wrexham AFC's existence at this point. But if I would argue 2 years ago, you would have had absolutely no idea, unless you were somebody in obviously Wrexham or maybe in Wales or maybe within England at large. But if you're, a diehard, English Premier League fan, who's based out of New York City, you probably had never heard of Wrexham AFC. But now you probably do, for this reason.
Fair statement. Yep,
right.
That's probably true.
Yeah. So it really is about sort of this cultural moment. How can we sort of talk about this and talk about the geography of it a little bit? And so with that, we talked a little bit about sort of, who are sort of the major players around here. What is Wrexham AFC? Why are we talking about them? Let's geographically situate ourselves a little bit. So like I just said, Wrexham is probably not a city that you're aware of unless you've now followed this saga, because otherwise it's not a huge city. We've already mentioned a couple of times that it's located in Wales.
It's in the north part of Wales, and it's pretty close to the border with England. And it's only like 45 miles or something from Manchester. So it's right there in the Midlands region. Yeah.
And just to further contextualize, and we talked a little bit about Scotland and Wales and England, obviously. Wales it's a smaller country that's within the sort of the overall arching sort of governmental body that is the United Kingdom. And so if you're a fan of Ted Lasso here, you might remember from the very first episode, there's a pretty funny quote where, Ted Lasso, played by Jason Sudeikis, says, "How many countries are in this country?" And his two assistants say 4. So I always thought that was a funny quote because it sort of plays into the fact that, yes, these are individual countries, Wales, Scotland, England, and Northern Ireland. Wales happens to be one of those countries. And Wales as a whole is pretty small relative to its
in the world of soccer, they're basically independent countries because they each have their own football association, their own national team. So
exactly
not recognized by the United Nations, Wales, but recognized by FIFA.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you're a fan of the World Cup, for example, you might have recognized that Wales played against the United States in the 2022 World Cup. I think we actually talked about this a little bit, why there was these 4 teams.
That's right.
In our World Cup episode. Again, not to do another callback, but hey, it's a good episode. So maybe you should
We're just footnoting our own work here. So go back and listen to that one. More information.
And so just to contextualize the city a little bit more, it is a really small city. So I have here the entire county of Wrexham, which is more than just the immediate city, had just over 135,000 people as of 2021. The city itself, which I could only find population figures dated 2011, was about 67,000-ish. So this isn't a large city. And I think, again, it's just helping to maybe tell the story a little bit about how this city and team are able to punch so much farther above them at the moment due to maybe some of these external factors. If this was a team that was maybe based in, even one of the larger cities in Wales, it might not be quite as interesting because obviously cities have come with their own certain sort of cultural cachet that Wrexham maybe isn't able to have just by the sheer nature of its size.
Oh, a little side note here that, Wrexham AFC has a women's team as well. This is a team that's been in existence for about 20 years, but has only been associated with Wrexham AFC until 2018 or something like that. So we'll be referencing the men's team mostly because that's the team that's been recently promoted. And but these same 2 actors own this club, which has this team as well. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of attention or resources are given to this, which is a semi-professional team, I believe, on the women's side of things. So just wanted to make sure we put that out there as well.
No, absolutely. I think it's a good point to make. And I'm more familiar with, obviously, the NWSL here. It's our women's league in the United States, but I'm more familiar with the French and German women's leagues because I think they're maybe a little bit better on the field than the English system. So maybe there's a bigger episode about women's soccer at a certain point. But yeah, certainly a good point to make. So with that, let's take a quick break because we are just humming right along here, and we're going to come back and talk a little bit about the history of sort of Wrexham and Wrexham AFC, just to again ground ourselves in sort of where this team even came from.
We'll be right back.
And we are back talking about Wrexham AFC, the sort of soccer phenomenon that's sort of spearheaded by 2 very, very, very famous people, or at least one very, very famous person and just another very famous person. But before we talk more about Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney and sort of where Wrexham is today, let's talk a little bit about the history of Wrexham and Wrexham AFC, because there's some interesting sort of stuff that we were able to uncover. So, and we really can't talk about the history of the soccer team without also talking about the history of the town, because there's a story here that sort of gets wrapped up into sort of the industrialization and then the globalization phase of capitalism. And so we'll talk
about the rise of modern sport here, right, as we do.
Right.
This.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think on that note, we're going to talk a little bit about the stadium that they play in. But I was trying to do some research and I wasn't able to find anything definitive, but it's just about sort of when sort of the idea of a stadium for spectators really arose globally. And I think that's a really fun question to sort of to think on, because I think it establishes, this idea of sport, not just for playing and exercise and competing, but also for entertainment.
Well, definitely stadiums, definitely the kind that we know them as today, where you pay to get in and all that kind of stuff. That definitely was something that happened in conjunction with the Industrial Revolution. And I think we talked about this in a previous episode, but really quick, there was a form of folk football, it's loosely termed, and it was kind of a different kind of sport that there was very little demarcation between the participants and those that were observing. There was no clearly delineated field or anything, no time limit, this kind of stuff. And so sport becomes rationalized. In other words, it starts to have the trappings of control and of borders and constrained by time as it becomes part of urbanization that happens during the Industrial Revolution. And in England, soccer is one of the sports that is really conflated with this growth of cities. In the United States, in the Northeast particular, it was baseball. And so you see the rise of baseball stadiums. And so it's interesting. The name of the ground is it the
racecourse ground?
Yes, the racecourse ground. And so this is not surprising either, based on some research I've done on other things, which is that a lot of times some of the first established venues for sport were for horse racing, and they were a little bit further out of what was the core of the city at that time. And a lot of those subsequently were used for other sports, including soccer. And so in this case, I think it was cricket and horse racing were some of the uses for this venue before 1864, when the ground was established as a place for association football or soccer.
Exactly. Yeah. So we're going to get to the racecourse ground in a quick second here. Let's talk a little bit about sort of the town and sort of how maybe it kind of came to be. Obviously, this is a city that takes place in Europe, which means it has a long, old history attached to it. And we're not going to dive into that other than just to say that, it's been inhabited in one form or another, at least the general area, dating back before, into the BCE era, before, Roman times, and all that kind of stuff. I have here sort of in my notes that the name Wrexham was first recorded in the 13th century, more as, and I'm going to try and pronounce this correctly, but Gregson, sort of with a G. I don't know if that's exactly right. I'm sure there's a historian probably based in Wrexham that would obviously know this, but just know that, as we're talking about England and Wales and, Europe in general, we're talking about a history that goes back much farther than maybe we're accustomed to talking about when we're talking about, cities here in the United States. And I always like to make that clarification, especially for our US audience, because I think people just don't realize just how much older things really are when you go.
And certainly in the United States, there are people who predate Europeans,
exactly,
who established themselves in communities for a long, long time. But in terms of the cities that we're familiar with today, much more recent phenomenon.
Exactly. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and we're just going to go ahead and jump to the 1700s, because that's when the Industrial Revolution really starts to kick off for England, for Great Britain, right? So the Industrial Revolution I have in my notes, it sort of began in 1762 with the entrepreneur John Wilkinson.
So this is specifically how the Industrial Revolution gets kicked off in Wrexham, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. So he starts sort of a shop or a little factory called Bersham Iron Works. And so this would presumably be a factory that's, doing something with iron and sort of the industrial sort of fashion of trying to streamline the process and manufacture a lot of things at once. And so if people weren't aware as you're listening to this episode, and I think obviously there's a future episode on the Industrial Revolution someday, but the Industrial Revolution is largely considered to have started in Great Britain, sort of around this time. I think closer to Manchester is sort of where it's actually thought to have started. I don't know if there's debate on that amongst historians. I'm not an Industrial Revolution expert.
The specific city is maybe debated, but certainly in the area around Manchester, which, Wrexham isn't very far away. This is the part of England and Wales where industrialization first occurred.
Right. And so Wrexham was right there, sort of kind of churning with the rest of Wales and England in terms of manufacturing and production. They weren't very far behind. Now, granted, again, Wrexham was not a big city. They're not a huge manufacturing base, certainly nothing like London or Manchester, even back then. So, it's relatively, right-sized for them. However, they definitely did start sort of industrializing and doing all of this wealth creation that comes with that revolution. So by the mid 1800s, Wrexham was growing to become less of a town and really more of a city. So mind you, it's still not that big, nothing like Great Britain, Great Britain's largest cities. But I have here in my notes, by 1851, the population of Wrexham was, around 6,700 people. By 1880, this had increased to about 11,000 people, which, I mean, it's growth. But I do want to sort of contextualize that because it's not that much growth relative to maybe some other places sort of growing at this time. So, I have here, to put this in perspective, San Francisco, obviously a much farther place away around the country, but when it was officially incorporated in 1850, it had about 25,000 people. And then by 1880, again, the same timeline as Wrexham here, it had grown to over 233,000 people. So
San Francisco is a pretty extreme example of growth, because this is all, there's not too many places that have a gold rush associated with it, right? I mean, there are some, but not that many. So San Francisco's growth was very much tied to that.
Exactly.
And it's hard to know how big that growth in Wrexham was compared to other places nearby. But yeah, so not the most extreme example, but industrialization makes the city grow.
Yeah, and industrialization is what makes it from more of an agricultural village to something we would associate with being a city, right? So this is also when Wrexham is actually starting to make a name for itself nationally, right? So there are products now coming out of Wrexham that people are starting to associate with this place. So
I think the leather industry was one of the big first industries there.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, and that's a big moment for any city when things are starting to be known for your place, because not every place has that, right? Not every town has that sort of geographical sort of cachet amongst the things that are coming out of it. So as Wrexham's growing, obviously we talked a little bit about the cricket club. In 1864, the Wrexham Association Football Club, this is where the AFC comes from in their name, was officially founded. So this is their soccer team. According to my research, and I know there's some competing sort of facts and figures out there. According to my research, it's the fifth oldest association football club in the world. Some claim it's the third oldest. I don't know exactly. I think regardless of whether it's, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, whatever, regardless, we can say that it is one of the oldest professional clubs that are still operating today.
And it's apparently the oldest one in Wales.
And it's the oldest one in Wales. I think that one we can definitely track that one, which is very impressive, right? This isn't to say that teams weren't started before that, but they're not continuing on to this day. So Wrexham has been playing every single year, aside from, I believe, the World War II years, has been playing every single year since 1864. That's a good
run.
That's a good run. That's longer than a lot of countries in the world have been around. It's longer than a lot of cities in the world have been around. So it's quite impressive. And to your point, Hunter, earlier, it was actually formed out of the Wrexham Cricket Club as really just as members kind of wanted to play something in the winter months. So cricket's a summer sport. They want something to play in winter. And so this was sort of the way that they were able to do that. Now, I think this kind of is a little bit different from maybe how we have heard some stories of some of the major teams in the English Premier League, how they got started, which is more like a bunch of factory workers started a team. And that's where it gets built in sort of the myth and legend around those teams. Wrexham AFC didn't necessarily have that same story, despite having this industrial sort of aspect of their city. They seem to have formed out of the cricket club. And then the team plays at its current stadium at Racecourse Ground, which opened the same year. So opened in 1864. And again, for my notes, it is the world's oldest international soccer stadium that still hosts international matches. So they first hosted Wales in 1877, and apparently Wales will still play there today.
Yeah, I think in my notes I have that they've hosted more national team games for Wales than any other stadium in Wales.
Which is interesting because if people are not familiar with Racecourse Ground, it's not huge.
No, it's like just over 10,000 or something. Yeah. Which, of course, there are plans to expand it right now and add like 5,000 seats, which is a lot for a stadium that has 10,000 seats.
Yes, there are plans to expand that based on their recent successes and their new ownership group. But yeah, it's a small stadium. Cardiff would have a much larger stadium, so you would think that, as an international team, you would want to play inside your largest stadium within maybe some of your larger cities. But there's also a certain sort of cultural placeness to Wrexham, I think, that Wales likes to be attached to. Certainly now, but I think this is even predated the current ownership group and sort of the phenomenon that we're talking about today. So, and this isn't uncommon. I think, here in the United States, the U.S. men's national team doesn't always play in LA or New York. In fact, one of their sort of most cherished quote unquote homes is Columbus, Ohio, which is where the Columbus Crew play. And there are reasons for that. There's some, kind of, mythology sort of attached to why they play there, versus some of their highest competition. So all that's to say, this isn't entirely atypical for a international team to prefer one location over another, even though it might not be the most culturally prominent or largest city. And so really the city, the team and city sort of got their start in part due to the Industrial Revolution, right? Even though Wrexham has been, around for centuries, millennia probably before that, really as it sort of formed into its own city as part of the Industrial Revolution, that's sort of when Wrexham also got its start. And so these sort of things go hand in hand with each other. The wealth and prominence, with wealth and prominence came identity, and with the identity came the desire for a sporting team. I think this is pretty natural. It's a pretty natural evolution for a lot of places in the world. I have here in my notes the Turf Hotel, which was highly featured in the docuseries. If you've watched that, it's almost like its own character, to be honest. Still exists today and is where the team was actually founded. So kind of an interesting sort of side note there. We're not going to bother going through sort of Wrexham's history year by year. This isn't a sports podcast. We're trying to get at sort of the high moments and talk about sort of the geography of it all. But I think the important thing to note here is that the performance of the team largely sort of marches to the same beat as the performance of the city. And so during the post-World War II years, during rebuilding and revitalization, Wrexham was actually performing very well. And they sort of hit some high points. During the late 50s and 60s, however, the city and region were in a recession, and it shows inside their performance. Wrexham AFC would make it all the way up to the second tier of the English Welsh soccer pyramid. I don't know what it was quite called back then. I know names have changed over the years. But shortly after that, something else would sort of take the world by storm. And in particular, it would hit industrial towns sort of all over the world, and that is globalization. And
right. So a lot of the factory jobs that were established during industrialization and ran for a long time start to diffuse, start to spread to other places. Right. And you have a period of deindustrialization. And famously, cities that were heavy manufacturing areas struggled a lot with that process and continue to struggle with that process.
Yeah. And so Wrexham would never again reach as high of a place within this soccer pyramid as it did in 1978.
And I think it was 3 or 4 years or something that they were in that division.
Yeah. Yeah, basically so they had their best performing year in 1978. They were still in the second tier for another year or two after that, but then it was a pretty sharp drop.
And I think they dropped a division, like one or a couple divisions in 2 or 3 years or something.
Yeah.
So
it was pretty bad. So they would eventually sink to the fifth tier. It's the quote unquote the National League, where they would kind of languish from about 2008 up until today. So that kind of brings us up to sort of the current situation where, it's now rebounding due to this, fun new ownership group that's spearheaded by Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney. And so
there was a vote. Wasn't there a vote among the supporters?
Vote, yes. And if I remember correctly, I don't have it in my notes, but if I remember in my head, I believe 98.6% of the supporters trust that sort of gets to make these decisions voted in favor of them purchasing the team. So it was dominant.
Right.
Yeah.
They're like, you're going to bring money into this situation and help us out. Yeah, we'll go for that. Let's see what happens.
So, I mean, kind of brings us to sort of this question, which is, how does a Canadian American movie star and an American TV star come to own a Welsh football club? Which is just a fascinating thing. It's a fascinating question to ask.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of this trend we alluded to earlier, where teams, particularly in Europe, particularly in England, have been bought by people from other countries. And so Southwest Asia, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Qatar, and a number of teams have been bought by Americans, by people from the United States in particular. And so this is part of that trend in a way of the wealthy saying that they want to be involved in sports management.
Totally. Yeah. So let's talk a little about who Ryan and Rob are. I mean, we talked a little bit about that, but let's dive in a little bit because they're interesting people. And so we'll talk about Ryan first. He's the big name. He's the movie star. So Ryan Reynolds, he's a Canadian American movie star, but he was originally born in Vancouver, BC, which means he is officially a Cascadian local, which I have to call out.
Okay.
But he's also, he's very well known for his movies. We ran through a few of them earlier, but he's also a very active entrepreneur and business investor. So, Hunter, have you ever heard of Aviation American Gin?
I have. Yeah.
And why have you heard about that?
Well, I know it mostly because it's based in Portland, where we live.
Woo!
Because Ryan Reynolds owned part of it up until just recently. And I think he had 20 or 25% ownership in that. And when it was sold to one of the biggest beverage conglomerates in the world, he made quite a lot of money off of that.
Yeah. So he acquired a large stake in 2018, and kind of similar to what's happening with Wrexham, he uses his name and his prominence to really accelerate its growth to a point where Aviation American Gin was sort of known. It was brewed by or distilled by a company here called House Spirits, sort of known locally, maybe regionally, but other than that, certainly wasn't known nationally. And he was able to then bring that up to a point where this company, I might mispronounce their name, Diageo, purchased it for $610 million. And if you're not familiar with that brand, they own other brands such as Johnny Walker, Guinness, Captain Morgan, and many more. So huge brand. What about Mint Mobile?
So same thing. Mint Mobile is a company that Ryan Reynolds invested in not a super long time ago. And in the last few years has become very popular, and it was just bought by T-Mobile for an enormous sum of money.
A lot of money. Yeah. Over $1 billion. Full disclosure. I've been a customer of Mint Mobile for a number of years. It's good. It's nice and cheap cell phone service, which I like. But I think it just goes to show again, he, as being a customer, I know how prominent he's been because each Christmas I would get a Christmas card from Ryan Reynolds as being part of the Mint Mobile.
He sort of brings to his he brings that Deadpool kind of personality to his advertising, and people, that seems to be popular. At least the advertisers think it's popular with people because they continue to promote their brands that way.
Exactly. And so he's now doing this with a few other companies, Fubo TV, Match.com, 1Password. These are all companies that he has involvement with. And the reason why we're talking about these companies and sort of Ryan Reynolds is because this is following a pattern of his where he's he's not just investing as a silent investor. He is definitely very active. He uses sort of what he has already built for himself to then further prop up the things that he is investing in. He's
a little foreshadowing for Wrexham, obviously. I mean,
exactly.
So this is part of his personal brand.
Exactly. Yeah. But of course, we can't talk about Ryan without also talking about Rob McElhenney. So Rob McElhenney, he's an American TV star, not quite as well known as Ryan Reynolds. Obviously, he is an A-list, movie star. But Rob, certainly is, still fairly famous. He's probably most famous for creating the FX series It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, which has been running and I believe is still running since 2005. He also has a pretty prominent role with some Apple TV Plus things. They do make sort of light of this disparity in the docuseries, so I don't feel too bad about calling it out. I don't think I'm going to rub egos the wrong way if Rob and Ryan happen to listen to our podcast. And so it might seem weird that these two bought a team, but let's talk a little bit about sort of the lead up to purchasing the team. So according to the docuseries, obviously this is dramatized and glamorized a little bit, but according to the docuseries, sort of the purchase of the team sort of kind of stems out of Rob's love of the Philadelphia Eagles, sort of as a driving force for what, a sporting team can mean to a city. Whether that's true or not, I don't know if we're here to debate that. Yeah.
Clearly he's a huge sports fan and a huge Eagles fan. And there's a picture of him, I think, a playoff game, a Super Bowl or something with the Eagles. Mm-hmm. But yeah, why he really decided to buy this team is a little bit left to our imagination, even when examined in the series, I feel like.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's this BBC article where they interview Humphrey Kerr, which is a former writer who used to work with Rob on, I think maybe his most recent show on Apple TV Plus, maybe some other shows. I'm not exactly sure. He's now sort of helping to manage this team in Wrexham AFC. But apparently, according to him, he would watch, soccer games during their lunch breaks, and Rob would sort of tease him about it. But, loving sport in general, eventually he got pulled into being a soccer fan. And that's sort of where he learned about promotion and relegation and sort of how all these things can work. And so there's this quote here. It says, I'm laying claim to the fact that Rob's interest in football derives from several years of teasing me for watching football during our lunch breaks at work, until eventually, just by pure osmosis, I got him interested in the game to the degree that he decides to buy a football team. There's some pieces missing from the middle of that. I don't think you just go from liking the team to then buying a team, but
it's interesting. I mean, this speaks to the globalization of the sport. Whereas, 20 years ago, it was harder to watch. Maybe totally. 25 years ago, it was much harder to watch European soccer in the United States, and then became a little bit easier. It's actually starting to become harder in some ways because you have to pay for certain services. Mm-hmm. But in any case, the fact that there are games regularly broadcast in the United States and other parts of the world speaks to the globalization of this sport and to English soccer in particular.
Exactly. Yeah. The mere fact that he was able to watch sort of his games on, probably a laptop at lunch breaks, all this kind of stuff speaks to just sort of how much more available globally the sport has become. So from there, according to multiple articles, Rob contacted Ryan. Apparently they were friends about potentially going in on purchasing a team with him. Seemingly
were they friends before? I'm not only have to dwell on this too much, but I thought I remember from the documentary or the docuseries that they met for the first time after they decided to buy the team or something.
They did, yeah. So apparently they were text friends. That's what everything I've read. So they had sort of had this communication back and forth with each other, just sort of vamping on various topics. I don't know to what extent they were friends, but I think an article I read very specifically called them text friends.
So this is another interesting thing where that kind of technology where you can call yourself somebody's friend without ever met them in person, to the point where they're going into this major business endeavor together, having never met in person, speaks to the era that we're in, I think, as well.
Yeah. Lifestyles of the rich and famous, huh?
Right.
Seemingly, with little persuasion needed, I don't know how true this is, but Ryan got on board pretty quickly. Again, we're not privy to a lot of these smaller details, but apparently it didn't take too much. So they decided to buy a team, but why did they buy Wrexham AFC? So again, back to the BBC article that I read, they didn't just hone in on Wrexham right away. There was some criteria that they sort of drew up to look at purchasing a team. And so they looked at Irish teams, they looked at Scottish teams, they were all in sort of the mix, but ultimately they wanted something within the English system because of the English Premier League. There was far too much of an upside there versus an Irish or a Scottish team. Although it should be noted,
suggests they're looking for something where they can get a lot of exposure because they've chosen a team in the Scottish League or certainly the Irish League. This wouldn't have as much potential for the global growth of the brand that they've kind of underscored in the last couple of years.
Though, yeah. So, but it should be noted that apparently they were looking at Irish teams specifically to sort of hearken to Rob's heritage, right? Which I thought was an interesting sort of point to make. And obviously we talked a lot about the sort of the Irish diaspora in our potato episode because that sort of features prominently in that story. Obviously they went with Wrexham because it stood out for a variety of reasons. One, it still had a very strong fan base. So there's people who's still very clearly passionate about the team. It's not true for every place. The history of being higher up in the English Welsh soccer pyramid, right, had made it all the way up to that second tier. And then 3, it was relatively cheap. So it was sort of, languishing in sort of this National League, the fifth tier. And therefore, they were able to acquire it for not a huge amount of money. I think it was, a few £1 million. I don't have the exact figure off the top of my head.
A lot to you and me, but not so much to those guys.
Exactly. Yeah. Well beyond our range. Their ultimate goal is to eventually turn Wrexham into a top tier team in the Premier League, which is largely considered to be the most popular soccer league in the world. We'll talk a little bit about that when we come back from these lovely ads from our sponsors.
Stay tuned.
And we're back, still talking about Wrexham, if you can believe it. A whole episode on this very tiny Welsh soccer team, but a lot going on with them. But before we dive into maybe the geographic phenomenon that is Wrexham AFC today, let's talk really high level about the geography of maybe soccer at large. And I think, obviously we say this all the time, but this is, this could be a couple parter episode, I think, in the future, because there's so much there. So obviously, it's a complicated topic, but Hunter, what would you think is the largest soccer league in terms of, let's just say, revenue generated?
League, right? Not team?
League, yeah.
I would say it's the English Premier League.
It is absolutely the English Premier League. And it's really not even close. It goes the English Premier League and then the Bundesliga and then La Liga and then Serie A and then Ligue 1, which I believe is based out of France. And to get, the German Bundesliga, obviously Germany is a very wealthy, prominent country within Europe. Its teams are very popular within the country. They're starting to get sort of an international presence as well. Certainly when you look at, a team like Bayern Munich or even, Dortmund or, some of these other teams. Knowing all of that, we can still say, based on revenue generated, that the English Premier League is generates roughly twice as much revenue as the German Bundesliga. And so it is, it's far and away the most popular soccer league in the world. In fact, I have here the TV rights deal for the Premier League from 2022 to 2025 stands at about £5 billion within the United Kingdom. And
that's the UK alone.
That's just the UK. Yeah.
Okay.
And then an additional £5 billion for overseas TV deals. So about $10 billion in total for these 3 years. Now, this would be the first time ever that the overseas deals are now outweighing the UK deals. So I believe the actual amount was like $5 billion, $5 million or something like that, or pounds rather.
But it speaks to the enormous appeal that this league has in other countries.
Exactly. So there's a right. It's now growing to the point where it's becoming incredibly dominant outside of the country as well. Now, I did want to contextualize this a little bit because $10 billion is a massive amount of money. However, if we just come back to the United States for a little bit and we look at the NFL, from what my research, what I could find was that for the NFL, the TV rights deal here in the U.S. alone is worth about $10 billion per year. And in fact, if we look at a list of revenue generated by leagues worldwide, so in all different kinds of sports, Hunter, do you have an idea of what maybe the top 5 teams or top 5 leagues might be?
So the Premier League we've already established, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it sounds like the NFL could be one of those potentially. And then I would go with, the Bundesliga you mentioned, maybe the NBA, but I'm thinking it would be mostly soccer leagues.
It is not mostly soccer leagues. If we take the top 5 by revenue generated, the first one is the NFL.
Okay.
The second one is MLB, Major League Baseball. The third one is the NBA. The fourth one is the English Premier League. And the fifth one is the NHL.
Interesting. I guess this speaks to the size of the United States, too.
It speaks to the size.
The United States is the size of a bunch of European countries.
Right.
And certainly there's interest in these sports, particularly baseball, I would guess, in other countries. I know that there's some interest in American football in other places, but not as much as there is in baseball. So I think that those revenues for the NFL must be largely based in the United States.
Exactly. Yeah. And, to the, English Premier League sort of, point, their sort of US based television rights deal is now in the billions of dollars just by itself. I mean, granted, that's over this 2022 to 2025 year. So it's 3 years, not 1 year. However, it's still, it's getting quite prominent. The sport in general, all leagues are sort of growing. I think MLS's latest deal with Apple is somewhere around the tune of $2.53 billion for a number of years. I'm not exactly sure how much, but
what's striking about the NFL is that they don't play that many games compared to these other leagues. I mean, certainly baseball, but even compared to soccer.
Oh, it's incredible.
Yeah.
It really does. The NFL, this isn't about the NFL, although we've talked about them in other episodes in the past, but the NFL really is, certainly within the United States, the overwhelmingly dominant sport in the country, and it does not appear to be changing
in terms of revenue, not participation by kids or anything like that.
No, in terms of revenue, eyeballs, quote unquote, sort of fandom, all that kind of stuff. Maybe even the cultural ness attached to the teams. But the Premier League is not equally popular throughout it, right? So the league has its haves and its have-nots. That could be said about it basically any league. So while this does track in terms of revenue, this $10 billion, it in terms of something like social media, there are teams that have a disproportionate amount of weight applied to them. So I just gonna ask you this, Hunter. Which team do you think within the English Premier League has the largest following on social media?
I think for a long time it was probably Manchester United, but it's probably Manchester City now.
It's Manchester United still.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah.
So so that makes sense because they've just got this trajectory of being a really successful team for a long time.
Yeah. So Manchester United, I think at one point they were considered to have, I think I saw a figure floating around. It was like they have 600 million fans globally.
Whatever that means.
Right? I mean, and how do you even track that? I don't know. Fandom is not it's not really a number that you can really track because somebody could say that they're a fan, but are they really?
And there's not everybody's in the planet's not being interviewed on what their favorite teams are. So there's some estimation involved. Right?
Exactly. So, it gets really wishy-washy. But all that's to say, in terms of social media following, again, whatever that means, and I think there's some debate on how much does it mean when somebody clicks follow on Twitter or Instagram, right? Does that actually mean anything? But it does give us a number that we can at least talk about. So just in comparing the English Premier League, we can say that, Manchester United is incredibly dominant, hundreds of millions of followers across all of their media platforms, and it sort of tracks down sort of with the English Premier League as you get sort of some of the smaller teams, right? So Arsenal and Tottenham and Chelsea and Manchester City, all very dominant as well. As you get down towards the bottom, you get to teams that are sort of floating around in sort of your low millions, maybe even like 1 or 2 million in terms of total social media following. And I think Nottingham Forest, which we talked about and was recently promoted, if I'm correct on that, in terms of to the Premier League, has around 1.7, 1.8 million followers across all social media.
Right. I mean, this is one way to measure things, right?
It's just one way. Yeah. Yes. It just gives us a number to talk about, right? And so the reason why we're talking about social media is because it kind of gives us an easy comparison to make with our team, Wrexham AFC. So we sort of we've sort of contextualized sort of the English Premier League, why it's so dominant in the world. Now let's talk about sort of what that means with respects to this geographic phenomenon that is Wrexham AFC. So since Ryan and Rob have purchased the team, it really has seen a sort of meteoric rise in terms of global popularity relative to where it was. And again, we don't know if this is a long-lasting affair. I don't think anybody can predict that, but certainly where it was a couple of years ago to where it is today, certainly has ridden this wave that's been paid for and brought on by Ryan Reynolds primarily, but also Rob McElhenney. So we can sort of mark this through social media. And that's why I kind of want to talk about social media following. So as of February 2023, the team had a combined social media audience of over 1.5 million followers globally. Now, we talked a little bit about Nottingham Forest and sort of the lower Premier League teams. Wrexham's not quite at that level in terms of social media followings, but it's getting closer, right? It's far away, stronger than a lot of, it's now peer teams in the fourth tier. It's probably far and away stronger than a lot of third tier teams and probably a lot of championship, which would be the second tier of English soccer as well. So it's kind of, it's at a level where it is, maybe not directly competing with, the lower end Premier League teams in terms of global brand recognition, but certainly it is far, far away and above where it should be. And again, just to put this in perspective, because I have to tie it back to Portland in some way. I always do. Portland Timbers, our Major League Soccer team here in Portland, has a combined social media presence of about 940,000 followers. So just to give a sort of a perspective, obviously Portland, a much, much larger city than Wrexham.
Although not one of the biggest cities in the United States.
Not one of the biggest cities. No, absolutely not. It would be the 25th, I think.
Oh, has it climbed up to 25 from 29 or something?
Yeah. It's in terms of metro area, it's 25th, I think.
Okay.
And so that's just sort of, to give you an idea of, situated, but there are other things, right? There's the team, Wrexham sort of had a pretty deep run in the FA Cup, which is sort of a national tournament in England and Wales, where it was played on ESPN2, I believe, and 139,000 people tuned in to watch it here in the United States. That's pretty prominent. That's would be unknown like that. That's something that would absolutely be unheard of. Certainly minor leagues here in the United States don't get nearly that amount of attention. So it's kind of impressive that a very small Welsh soccer team was able to draw that many eyeballs so far away from where it's located.
And this has everything to do with the owners, really.
It has everything to do with the owners, right?
Because it's not, this is still fifth tier soccer in England, which, England has fantastic soccer teams. What's that?
This was the FA Cup, so they were playing Sheffield. So there's, there could be some attachment to that.
Right. But it's not like watching a Premier League game in terms of the players who command the salaries and have the skills that a Premier League would have. Yeah.
Yeah. And and I think, if I don't have this in my notes, but if I can vamp on that a little bit, it's really is interesting to maybe track some of these players who are playing in this fifth tier team who I don't want to be, blunt about it, but they're probably not Premier League quality players. I don't think that's unfair to say. And I think, hopefully I wouldn't rub them the wrong way by saying that. They're probably very skilled at soccer in general, certainly better than me, but they're able to ride this wave as well just by being attached to this team, where they would never they would never become a household name, right? I can tell you, one of the players just by watching the docuseries is named Paul Mullins. I would never know Paul Mullins' name had it not been for this moment they're having. And so it's almost, and we're going to talk about this in a minute here, but they're about to do this summer soccer tour here in the United States, Wrexham is, and Paul Mullins is sort of being advertised around sort of the country as these things. Like he's sort of the star
of the series, right? So people, they need to have a team. It's going to have to go beyond the owners a little bit, and they're going to have to start to create some notoriety around some of the players if people are going to continue to follow the situation beyond sort of the novelty of famous Hollywood guys owning a soccer team.
Exactly. And so I just have one other stat to maybe sort of talk a little bit about maybe the global sort of prominence of this team. So according to Wrexham's sort of own stats, they'd sold over 24,000 sort of jerseys to people outside the UK as of sort of the beginning of this year. I've since found that this is from an article based in The Athletic, that an additional 35,000 have already pre-ordered the jersey for next season. So that's a lot of jerseys being sold to not people from really even Wales or England or the UK in general, but people from outside. So I don't imagine there's a lot of teams that are selling that many jerseys. I couldn't find a lot of statistics on a lot of teams. I couldn't find any for MLS, for example. I was able to find some for the bigger teams inside the sort of the English Premier League, in which case I have here that at the 10th place in sort of the top 10 list was Manchester City with selling about 950,000 jerseys total. That's inside and outside the sort of the UK. Again, not to keep saying this, but I think this is just proving that even though this would be 35,000 for next season, that's still punching way above its weight in terms of maybe where any team should rightfully expect it to be selling jerseys. And so all of this is all on the backs of Ryan Reynolds and primarily Ryan Reynolds, but Rob McElhenney being able to promote this team to a very insane degree. And of course, this has now also attracted sponsors, right? So there's now global brands who want to be attached to them. So Aviation Gin, obviously, that has the direct connection as being formerly owned by Ryan Reynolds, but I guess he still does have some marketing positions within the company. But also TikTok is a big sponsor. Obviously, that's a Chinese social media company. And I know they've done some stuff with the team itself. And then also Expedia, which is, a pretty mammoth travel company. These are all companies that are trying to attach their names to this phenomenon. These are not Welsh companies. These are not even English companies or British companies, I should say. These are global companies that are sort of seeing this moment, and they see this as a way to attach themselves to this moment and this phenomenon, and probably Ryan Reynolds' name more specifically.
Right. Well, I mean, when I look at online, I'm reading about soccer as I do fairly frequently. Wrexham's AFC still gets the most attention when Reynolds is at a game.
Right.
When he's there watching, that's a news story in the world of soccer. And of course, they need to generate content every day, but this is something that does that for them. Whereas, they will share the results sometimes, but it usually relates back to the owners. And so exactly. the popularity of these stars, if Reynolds in particular as a global A-list movie star, it continues to be associated with the team and how a lot of the media attention is generated.
Yeah. And I think it's a really good question to ask is if, Ryan and Rob decide to sell the team tomorrow, even if Wrexham was able to continue, and they sold it to, let's say, another billionaire or whatever, to continue paying for the money and continue moving it up, would it have near half as much cultural global prominence as it does today? And I would maybe argue probably not.
It would be hard to argue that.
Yeah,
that it would. Yeah.
Yeah.
And, the other thing to think about is the era that we're living in with social media. I mean, if this had been done in the 70s or something, or the 80s,
exactly.
would this have as much attention, with the constant news cycle and social media constantly, able to garner advertising dollars because of these numbers, that's also a function of this moment of technology that we're in as well.
Exactly. Yeah. And so it's been able to attract these mammoth sponsors. There's this TV series, which has been renewed for season 2. So that'll be coming back apparently sometime this year. And it's really become sort of this, relatively minor, but still a global phenomenon that, to your point, 10, 20, years ago would probably not have been able to happen. Not nearly to the same degree as it has today. And so, Wrexham, AFC today, is recently promoted to the 4th tier of the English Welsh Soccer League called League 2, English League 2.
It's really the English League. There's some Welsh teams in it, but it's right. The Welsh League is something else. And this is the English League that some Welsh teams participate in.
That's fair. And so this is only about a year and a half after being purchased by Ryan and Rob. Apparently, getting out of the National League, which was the league that they were in, that 5th tier, is notoriously very hard to get out of. So they managed to do that. Who knows where they'll go next? They could continue their trajectory, or they could sort of languish. I guess time will tell. What we do know is that this summer, the team is going on a summer tour. I alluded to this earlier, where they'll participate in a tournament in North Carolina called the Soccer Tournament. I'm not entirely sure what this tournament is, but I did a little bit of research on it, and it appears to be some sort of 7 versus 7 soccer tournament with a wide variety of teams. So there's Wrexham. It looked like West Ham and Borussia Dortmund had a team going to this thing. I don't know. It seems a little weird to me, but apparently Wrexham will be there in some capacity.
Well, and then by just having 7-on-7, you don't have to bring as many players.
Exactly.
It's streamlined.
Yeah. Could be fun. I don't know. I'm intrigued, but I'm not going to fly to North Carolina to go do it. Then they'll go on to play Chelsea with, I guess, their full team in North Carolina. They'll then travel across the country to Los Angeles, where they'll play the LA Galaxy 2, which is a sort of minor league team associated with the LA Galaxy in Major League Soccer. They'll play in LA, and then they'll go on and play Manchester United and San Diego. So again,
I'm guessing maybe the top United and Chelsea players may not be in the mix, or it's probably not going to be the team they would field, against each other, for example.
No, I would say no. We'll see. Maybe like 1 or 2 players, because they, these Premier League teams do come over here and use these tournaments as a way to get fit before their league starts. So,
well, it's also they have guaranteed revenue, right, over the summer, and you can argue fitness, but these players don't have much of a break. And so, these tours have been happening for a while now. They're happening in Southeast Asia and other places as well. They're to increase exposure, revenue, marketing, but managers and players have notoriously been critical of them because it's a lot of travel at times when these players probably should be resting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. So, these teams are coming over here for all the reasons you pointed out. Who knows whether their, star players will actually play or not? Probably not many, if any do. I just think it's worth pointing out.
Coming off of the World Cup, which was just 6-7 months ago now.
True. Yeah.
These players, some of these high-profile players, are going to need a break, or they're going to get injured for their regular season.
Yeah. I do think it's worth pointing out that most Premier League teams would probably not be able to pull together a summer tour schedule sort of half as prestigious, right? Wrexham playing Chelsea and Manchester United is not something you would see a lot of other teams being able to do.
They're certainly capitalizing on their moment.
Yeah. So yeah, and that's sort of the story as it is today. This is sort of the geographic phenomenon that, how does a small Welsh city of, about 67,000 people, maybe a little bit more today, get to become so prominent. And it really is off the backs of Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney. That's not to do any disservice to the city or the team itself. It's just, that's sort of the reality and sort of the wonderful world of geography that is the sport of soccer. And so with that, Hunter, do you want to run through some pluggables?
Sure. I'm Hunter Shoby. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University, and I'm also co-author of a couple cultural atlases, Portlandist, a cultural atlas, and Upper Left Cities, a cultural atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle. with David Banis and a number of other contributors, including Geoff. And then I'm co-host of this podcast, Everything is Geography, with you, Geoff.
Yeah. And my name is Geoff Gibson. I am the co-host of this podcast, like Hunter said, you're listening to, and I'm also the host of a YouTube channel that's Geography by Geoff. You can go watch some videos that are just, quick little geography bites. If you're interested in that, you can find that at youtube.com/geography by Geoff. We also really appreciate it if you sort of rated and reviewed us on, Apple Podcasts or whatever app you're using to listen to podcasts. Just, it helps us. I really like seeing them. We have a few reviews now up on Apple Podcasts, which is cool to see, like actual written reviews, and people really like what we're doing. So we're just going to keep doing that. If you're interested in following us more closely, please go to our Substack. That's geographyiseverything.substack.com, where you can read more articles about geography. You can find this podcast there, and as well as any sort of future bonus episodes that we create. Those will live exclusively for our Substack community. So please find us there. And with that, we will see you next time.
Thanks for listening.